This episode, we've got Cactus Chu from Metapolitics Podcast. Cactus and I are going to talk about the state of the presidential pre-transition, how the media is covering it, and what the future looks like for the Yang Gang. And maybe we'll talk about Andrew Yang's prospects. So stay tuned. We're going to get started in 1 second.
There's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Pain, dang, is and Drew come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Pain, dang, is and Drew come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
Cactus, welcome to the show, sir.
Great to be here.
Where are you joining us from?
Yeah, so I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. It's great up here and really gives a bird's eye view of what's going on in the States.
Love it, love it. Are you, I used to work at Microsoft. We hired a ton of people from Waterloo. Are you, there's a university near there, I think, or?
Yeah, that's the university that I'm getting my degree in as well. It's just basically the most well-known university in Toronto not in Toronto, but in all of Ontario and in all of Canada for computer science, and generally ranked either the first or second. But yeah, it's very much the kind of MIT of the North.
Yeah, love it. And then you guys do like, I think Waterloo is the one where you kind of do these extended internships throughout the program. Is that right? Like, do you kind of like get deployed at companies for a little while? I just seem to recall the Waterloo people having a lot of practical experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example of how you have certain institutions that are kind of changing the landscape on how we think of either experiential learning, so things like apprenticeships, and how we think of technology. Because very much the technology space, at least in my experience, is highly centered around getting that understanding of specific companies' software, specific companies' kind of development process, and actually being able to integrate it. So yeah, basically throughout the year, you have some times where you check out of the university and head off to do an internship at a company for between either 4 or 8 months.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I think the U.S. system could probably try a little bit more of that experiential stuff. But let's talk about your podcast, so just people know a little bit more about you. And so we know that you are a student in CS.
Yeah, I have a long history in informatics. Basically, I started doing the competition level stuff. So best in the country, best in the world, even at computational informatics, at around even grade 7 or grade 8. And so I had a long background in computer science, and now I'm doing my degree in mathematics at U Waterloo. So,
Love it. And then you have a podcast.
Yes. So the Metapolitics Podcast really started basically as a connection for when I started looking into politics, because I started looking into politics based on the issue of misinformation. And it's very much something that's rampant in the United States. And what the mainstream media tends to get wrong here, and what even many people who I've just interacted with on a personal level tend to get wrong, is that misinformation isn't necessarily something that is fringe per se. It's something that spreads through the main conduits of information. Even things like television media, cable is truly an atrocity in the United States. And I think particularly since there are very lax standards in the States where I was born, there's significant disinformation that's actively being spread, not only on the internet, but on mainstream media and on various print media, all these sources that are supposed to be reliable. And what you've seen is a concrete death of trust in the States, where ordinary people don't feel like they can have one singular source, one place to refer to, where they have a guarantee of information. And that's part of what I'm trying to provide, as well as trying to provide the tools that's necessary in a mathematical sense to actually navigate a space where you don't have trust, where you can't necessarily say you turn on TV and know what you're hearing is true. Because in a model such as that, you're going to have a lot of convergent factors that direct the spread of information in one degree or another. And this is what I talk about many times on my podcast, is the characteristics that you can look for misinformation, the effects that this has on politics, and essentially is an education podcast to help people understand what they can do in order to, first of all, to change the system, but in order to live their lives themselves and actually be able to overcome all of that.
You know, I've heard this a lot, that the media has a lot of influence on people, that it's sometimes spreads disinformation, certainly biased in many cases. But I've heard it spoken about at a very anecdotal or theoretical kind of like hypothetical level. Are you saying, have you found ways to actually mathematically prove this?
I mean, a mathematical proof is somewhat different from statistical evidence, since you have to kind of basically justify it even more than beyond a reasonable doubt, but at like a true impossible level. So you could say that it's impossible for the sun to go out tomorrow, but really there is some kind of physical chance that there is some effect that you haven't detected scientifically that could happen. So when you talk about something being mathematically true, it's a completely different realm where it's literally something like 1 + 1, where you have to define it in basically every single possible scenario, and that's not really possible in real life. But what you can have is you can have verified evidence. You can have things like the Senate Intelligence Report, which of course many people cast suspicions on because it was prepared. Many people, particularly on the right, have suspicions on what it means that there was political influences from the Democratic Party. However, if you actually look at the methods of documentation, if you look at how it was passed down and reported on, there is significant statistical information in that report that talks about foreign interference on social media and some of the tactics that were actually used there. Now, it's important absolutely to make clear that this is not a partisan issue. And in fact, you had situations such as including the highest levels of mainstream news, including, for example, MSNBC, who was actively spreading Iranian disinformation, as well as similar stories being reported on major cable networks such as Fox News. So, first of all, there is significant evidence based on sources such as the United States government, but there's also a factor in play here where the cable networks are large enough that just having one cable network doing something, that's already, say, 10, 20 million viewers. So even if it's just a single report or a single story that's documented, that single story still reaches millions, and that's nonetheless a problem that we're facing.
Yeah, well, I was just watching the Giuliani Powell press conference this week, and I noticed that it was getting picked up on the One America News and Newsmax and Epoch Times, talking about
Epoch Times.
Yeah, and those three sources probably have tens of millions of audience that consume that information. And they were talking about, that the Hugo Chavez and the Castro family were involved in owning the vote ballot counting machines, and that it was an office next to George Soros's friend, and all this kind of crazy conspiracy theory stuff. But to some people, that's not crazy. That's their news.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we need to separate this into two components, which is what we can do at a personal level and what we can do in a systems-wide level, where we look at the actual incentives at play. First of all, if you're someone who has not even inclinations, but just doubts about what is true and what is not, and that's very reasonable to have, particularly with the state of media in the United States, the most important thing is to look at probabilities and to look at things with regards to either conjunctions or disjunctions. So many conspiracy theories follow the characteristic that they involve a conjunction of various different factors. For example, with regards to many of the conspiracy theories with regards to election interference, there has to be or election or quote unquote voter fraud, there has to be, first of all, someone who is going out and committing voter fraud. There has to be state officials, dozens of them, if not hundreds, thousands of them in various states across the United States that also comply with this, that look the other way. And of course, there has to be enough of this. There has to be a significant amount of volume in order to actually change the votes from one way to the other. So if you look at this having to happen in Georgia, having to happen in Pennsylvania, having to happen in Arizona, all these distinct voting systems that all have to be kind of in on the joke, in on the plan together, then when you look at the probabilities of this, it means that you have to multiply all of them together. So if you say, and this is obviously not true, it's obviously much lower, but even if you said that there was, say, a 1 in 10 chance for each of these states to be problematic enough to change the election, then that's amplified 10 times for each state. So if there's a 1 in 10 chance for Arizona, and then multiply that by the chance for Georgia, you have 1 in 100. Multiply that by the chance for Michigan, that's 1 in 1,000, and so on. So regardless of whatever your kind of gut instinct is for one of these situations, it's important that you look at the actual number of possible things that are required in order for something to actually be true, in order for a conspiracy to actually exist in real life. And almost all the time, if you do this very basic kind of first principles analysis of what is going on, then everything falls apart. The other thing to notice, however, is how American media systems actually make room for these types of things to occur. Many people, even in the media institutions themselves, have described this as a quote-unquote post-truth environment. And very much this is based on one of the mitigating factors that occurs in American politics. So something that I cover in a very recent episode of Metapolitics is that there's two fundamental connections to kind of human belief. There's a connection with regards to evidence, with regards to statistics, and those first principles that I mentioned already. Aside from that, there are connections to fundamental human values, fundamental ideas that people tend to have with regards to the way that they personally live their life. This is the kind of method that cultural issues use in order to connect with people. Now, in the 11th episode of the podcast, what I talked about was how many of these cultural standards are assumed on the level of fact. However, they can be very malleable and can change without actually causing significant influence on a person's life. So the example I gave there is the way you view secularism in France versus in the United States. In France, secularism is often seen as something that is separating not only the church and state, but the church and the public square. So if someone is interacting in public life, then they're often expected to act as if they were secular or act in a way that does not allow their religion to necessarily influence them. However, this is something that's considered completely different and would probably be considered a violation of religious rights in the United States, where there's often a strong belief, or at least a strong contingent in the United States that holds the belief that religion should be allowed to be a part of ordinary life in the way that people express themselves. Now, this is a fundamental cultural belief. However, it's something that people take as a guiding principle in their life, even though obviously France is still a free democracy and we can still say the same for the United States. However, when this interacts with the news media, and particularly when it interacts with a politics that's increasingly separating these cultures, essentially creating two distinct cultures within one country, then you have this blurring of the lines between cultural priorities, those first principles that are based on how people believe their society works and how people believe their own morality, and the first principles of kind of understanding information, of understanding statistics, and understanding kind of how to actually scientifically prove information. So when you have that, you have an attack that can be baselessly launched on any media organization, regardless of how productive it is. That means that you can have a left-wing outlet that, say, accurately reports on every corruption story with the left and the right, accurately reports economic numbers, accurately reports COVID numbers, and goes through all of this rigor, all of this process. But nonetheless, it can still be attacked by the right wing for, say, cultural issues such as abortion or transgender issues. And the same thing applies on the other side. People can attack, no matter how credible a right-wing source is, and I'm not saying that one particularly exists on the left or the right wing, but no matter how credible a source is, even if it does all of that fact-based reporting correctly, there's still an outlet for malicious actors, for political actors to try to discredit those sources based on underlying political beliefs. And that's what fundamentally has to happen, or that's what fundamentally has to be solved if we want to kind of escape the prevalence of disinformation, particularly by these completely ignorant of facts sources, is that we have to provide a way to allow viewers to separate the fact reporting from the opinion piece, from the cultural issues, so that you have a very, very clear separation, almost like the secularism, almost like the separation of church and state. You have a separation between the cultural and the otherwise factual. And while there may be some sources that definitely try to do this, and I appreciate them for doing so, that's something that's definitely just not being accomplished in the United States as of now.
Well, let's take an example. Jay Late Ray wanted us to talk about our view on the Epoch Times, because there's an example where I do think there are questions around the kind of ownership and kind of underlying founders' mission of the Epoch Times, like associated with the Falun Gong and that kind of thing. And to me, it's like, well, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to put as much credibility into their reporting, because I wonder, like, well, is there another agenda, or the fact that Fox News was started by, Roger Ailes and a, very influential Republican Party kind of influencer and consultant. What's your take on the Epoch Times? Like, if you take your approach, it sounds like many of us discredit it because of cultural reasons. We're like, well, we don't like the whole Falun Gong connection. But maybe you're saying, hey, we shouldn't be so hard on them, or what do you think?
Yeah, so cultural and essentially business or financial incentives are completely different. I think it's perfectly fine to question an organization if they have suspicious financial incentives. For viewers, I'm not sure if viewers are completely aware of this. I'm sure that my audience isn't necessarily, but essentially, Falun Gong is sort of a cult that markets itself as a wellness group, or that markets itself as kind of like this persecuted group of essentially like Chinese spiritualists. And while there may be some action that's being taken on them, they're certainly not necessarily a credible group themselves. As I said before, they do display many cult-like characteristics. And as such, because of said financial ties to those organizations, I don't think it would be just like a straightforward kind of, you should trust every source regardless of kind of where they're coming from. I'm certainly not advocating for that. What I should be clear on is that if there is a possibility of corruption, if there is a possibility of insider influence, that definitely has to be something that you take into account before looking at the actual stories, particularly when it involves fact reporting. With regards to the cultural piece, I don't necessarily mean that it's a separation between some of these criticisms and some of these kind of following the money, right? That's perfectly fine. It's a criticism of when you try to tie reporting on, say, bills being passed, when you try reporting on COVID, stimulus, economics, corruption scandals, and when you try tying that to the reporting on, say, abortion or the Supreme Court or various other cultural issues that don't have a clear answer.
One of the things you said, Cactus, was if you run the numbers and you assume there was this mass election theft, it would require a confluence of events that each in and of themselves are improbable, and the combination of them is even exponentially less probable. I get that. I think Jay Late Ray is now saying, well, we are assuming that people will take that kind of logic driven approach and filter through what they're being told, frankly, from White House press conferences, from the voice of the President of the United States, from the One America Network, from Newsmax, Breitbart. Do you see a path where people will think more critically? Because I don't see that trend happening.
The existence of that possibility is certainly different from the trend. And the trend is obviously something that's influenced by all sorts of other things, including political incentives, including financial incentives, and that is something else that we have to analyze. However, with regards to the kind of baseline appeal that I think should be attempted to be made to those first principles, every person has the ability to think critically. This doesn't mean that they will. It has to be a choice nonetheless. But with regards to people who are currently following those types of networks, and especially with regards to people who are kind of uncritically accepting information at hand, obviously that can change. That can change if they're interacted with someone who they know personally. It can change if they just stumble upon a news source that does actually make out these first principles arguments. It can absolutely be something that is effective. I mean, this is something that the Yang campaign itself proves, is that it's possible to reach out to people to actually make a logical argument with regards to automation and with regards to all these other financial issues. So while I certainly don't think it's, say, perfect, it's all encompassing to simply just say, make those appeals and everything will suddenly be all bright and sunny. It's certainly a step forward, and it'll certainly have an impact on at least some set of people.
Yeah, I guess the thing that gives me some pause is you're right that Yang was definitely a very logical kind of data-driven guy. Ultimately, he came in 6th place with like 1% of the post-alignment caucus votes. And I don't think it's because Yang isn't a great candidate. I think that people resonate to candidates more like a Trump, for whom it's very easy to agree with him if you don't apply a lot of critical thinking, right? If you have a bias out of the gates to be open to his arguments, then it's so great. It's so comfortable to say, yeah, it's the Mexicans' faults, or it's the Chinese faults, or it's the elitists on the coast's faults. And we just need to drain the swamp and lock up Hillary, and everything's going to be great again. It's just like, from a human psychology point of view, so much easier to buy into something that makes you feel good, that has a easy, like, black and white, right and wrong kind of angle, than to run the statistical probabilities of whether or not a mass election theft took place. It's easier to say, hey, I have this video of a guy selling ballots out of the back of his Civic. There, see, it was stolen. Than saying, oh, well, let's count how many votes would he need to sell, and then how many states and how many people would need to collude with him. That's just a hard conversation. And I wonder why. Well, how do you see us as having a path to get to a more deliberate, thoughtful, contemplative approach to our discourse? Because it seems like we're going in the opposite direction. People want, short TikTok videos. They don't want long, sadly, podcasts. Some of us do. But, like, if you talk to a lot of the younger folks out there, the attention span doesn't seem to be expanding.
Yeah, well, this is an effect that is being amplified certainly by social media, and I'd be glad to talk about that later. But I think there's a clear reason why this is happening most prominently in the United States instead of in other Western democracies. And of course, there are various fringe parties in those areas, but I think it's certainly clear that there hasn't been a majority support behind someone who is anti-factual or someone who is actively spreading conspiratorial belief. And at least from my perspective, especially here in Canada, where I'm able to kind of compare the information that I'm getting from American sources and Canadian sources, as well as from sources for other countries, such as France and the United Kingdom, there's a clear glut in the quality of media in the United States. And with regards to the basic kind of standards of journalism that you would have compared to, say, in any other Western democracy, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in France, and Germany. Because essentially what you have in the United States is you have a media system that is based off of fundamentally the same incentives as social media, even more so than any other country. So there's always been a sort of reluctance to actually regulate media in the United States. And of course, this is going to sound scary for many people whose minds instinctively jump to, say, a dystopian nightmare with like a ministry of truth. But that's not what is happening in Canada. That's not what is happening in France. And that's not what is happening in Germany. Of course, there can be common sense regulations with regards to basic verification of reporting and with regards to the journalistic duty that people have to actually go to these first principles explanations, to offer these higher levels of analysis. And you can see that in Canadian media and Canadian television with regards to interviews with doctors who are actually breaking down the mathematical processes behind COVID spread and generally introducing a higher standard of information to their audience, as at least from my anecdotal experience of watching the United States media, which is very much averse to that, as opposed to the situation in France or the situation in other developed countries. Now, I think that there's actually a severity in this problem that's grave enough that there actually requires an international intervention. And I don't think this is something that can be forced upon the United States, the world's strongest military, obviously. But I think there really has to be a moment of humility, a moment of understanding in the United States that the financial incentives around their own media infrastructure is simply not working. And to actually say, look, maybe we need to begin relying on the BBC, or we need to begin relying on the CBC, which is the Canadian version of that, or other news sources in English in the UK or in Canada. Because quite frankly, they're not subject to the same political pressures as those organizations in the United States. They're not subject to the merging of culture and information as in the United States. And of course, there's the question of whether people will actually decide to go for this higher standard of information, even if it's made clear in the politics. And that is an open question. I'm not going to pretend I have all of the answers. However, I think if that's something that becomes clear to the entire population, particularly with regards to their current political prospects, right? You can see people actively noticing the damage that this polarization is causing, not only for the actual election, the actual government, but also for the conflict that they're experiencing in their own personal lives. So I think if you ask people the question of whether you'll watch a source of media that maybe gives you more information and that will reduce the temperature on many of these things, then they'll actually choose to go for that.
You know, I hear where you're coming from, Cactus. I mean, we have NPR here. We have PBS. These are very similar to what you might hear on CBC or on BBC. People don't want to listen to that because it's not entertaining. There's no conflict. There's no clear villain. It tends to be very dry. It's not emotional. There's not a lot of tribal energy that you get from it. And if you turn on Fox News or OAN or Newsmax, or you listen to Alex Jones, like, people get really fired up and they feel more human. And it's like watching gladiators, and it's like watching a football game. There's conflict and there's good and bad and power. And I wonder, you seem to be advocating for this more enlightened approach, but you surely know that humans have primal instincts, and tribalism isn't like necessarily some manufactured phenomenon. It's like a biological bias that we have. How do you see like a path for mainstream people going in that direction? Because our system here in the States, you're right, it's profit generated and profit motivated. It gives people what they want. And there's a reason Fox is the #1 news channel, and it's not, The Economist. People don't want to read long form discussions and see data and charts. I mean, obviously, anybody watching this is into that kind of thing, but most people are not. They want to see Sean Hannity, laying into and owning the libs, and that's entertainment for them. Do you feel like, how do we get through that? How do you break through the whole notion of news as a form of entertainment?
On the first, there are sort of multiple layers of analysis to do on this. Once again, on the first kind of approach to the current institutional state of play in the United States, it's because there has been a history dominated by those 3 major companies, Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC, that has the historical appeal that isn't necessarily also present with regards to PBS, with regards to those other organizations. Of course, you can argue the same for the BBC, which of course is a historic kind of foundation of British television. But very much the audience that those companies hold may be supported by this prevalence of just having a long history and having people exist in a world where CNN had the trust, had the higher levels of trust, had the higher levels of standards that are reflected in other countries. And even in the private private broadcasters of those other countries, you don't see the same effect at play necessarily. The meta-analysis of this, first level analysis, is looking at what incentives those political organizers or those media figures actually have with regards to the United States. And there's very much a blurring of the lines, once again, between the United States political sector and their media sector. There's much more of a revolving door behind political connections, access journalism, etc., where there's a political incentive for these news companies to continue to feed that political urge, to continue to direct things towards partisanship. And that incentive is to gain further reputation and gain further access to news companies. Now, this, in some cases, in foreign countries, can just be outright illegal. And I think if you actually look at the legislation and compare them, then this is something that could be productively done in the United States. However, one of the problems with this is that the state of politics in the United States is so polarized that you're actually unable to implement these without rampant accusations of political bias. So in order to actually create some way out, in order to create the incentives that converge upwards to a better solution instead of converge downwards, I think there needs to be an importation of foreign media standards, of standards from, say, from other Western democracies into the way that American media works, and to just have oversight from those foreign areas, as you would expect with reporting in other countries where the media condition is unstable. With regards to the final layer, which is that kind of basic human incentive, there are various forces at play within every single person. And we all experience this in our daily lives, where we have kind of pull and push towards either being more forward thinking, being more pragmatic, and towards just your innate desires. Maybe you want to eat the candy bar. Maybe you say, oh, I should actually be losing weight right now. But really, the mitigation of this is by outside factors. The question isn't just whether you have these incentives, but whether you have a candy bar in front of you, whether you have a friend telling you that you should be doing better. And of course, this is something that's going to be incredibly blurry, in that where there needs to be more science done on. But for example, in Rutger Bregman's work, he talks about aspiring to greater appeals to humanity, to greater optimism about humans' ability to make decisions for themselves when advocating for things like universal basic income. So there is an opportunity here to actually look at the mitigating factors. And obviously, I don't have the full case on this. No one does. And I'm absolutely in favor of having more science with regards to how to actually incentivize those more positive behaviors. However, I do think it's something that we can make progress on. And I do think that the work of various experts and writers has paved the way for more research to be done on this.
You know, I'm all for voters gathering information from as many authoritative and reliable sources as they can find, including those outside of the country. I guess I do have some reservations about the notion of other countries sort of regulating or having any statement about American media coverage, because it's not like other countries don't have biases as well. Like in the case of Canada, like I'm not sure if we're in the middle of a trade negotiation with Canada that I'm going to trust what the CBC is saying about those negotiations, or for the BBC, if we are trying to take a position on Brexit, or, you know, any number of things. Yes, I agree. When you look at polarized media, the US is a leading example of how far it can get. But I'm curious, like, how you think any country would be okay with other countries' state-influenced media telling us their version of reality.
So this obviously is a question of trade-offs. I'm not saying that it's going to be an absolute unyielding good in order to import one singular resource, right? And there has to be kind of a collaboration between what American people, American officials already know, and between those other standards. However, I think that many of the concerns that you laid out there are correct. And if you're looking at issues where there are tensions between the interests of the United States and other countries, that has to be something that is done here. With regards to kind of the deeper philosophical question of whether we should be actually actively reaching out to other countries and asking for kind of their sharing of information with us. I mean, I was born in the United States. I've come back basically very frequently, and quite frankly, the culture here is great. There's a strong reason to have a sense of American exceptionalism, to have especially with regards to business, particularly small business, and with regards to the way that communities generally work and support each other. That's a great thing to feel. But I think that even if you ask regular Americans, and I don't have the polling numbers off the top of my head, but their dissatisfaction with their own media is much higher than the dissatisfaction with all of these other countries. So I think that there's clear evidence, and that's an easy case to kind of sell to many of the American people who already do have these ideas, these correct ideas, that their media isn't working as well as in many of these other countries. So I think that there's just an opportunity for a moment of humility, for a moment of understanding, where we say, look, yeah, we have great success with regards to our business, with regards to our communities, with regards to the people, and with regards to how we're moving forward. But one area where we're not the best is the media, and people already believe that.
Well, let's sort of finish this conversation the way we started, Cactus, which was around education. Because I guess I am of the belief that the same way racism is not you're not born with it, but you're taught to be racist by your parents if you are. I also think the absence of critical thinking is also handed down from generation to generation. And I am less optimistic that we will get less biased sources of information. I feel like we just have to train the next generation to be more critical thinkers and to be able to interpret biased sources and try and challenge the assumptions that are kind of baked into what they're reading and hearing and seeing. And I'm curious, like, what's your take on education? Because there's a funny Twitter video that was getting passed around where basically this mother was calling her school, her teacher, and complaining that her third grader who was trying to learn about the election was being taught that Biden had won. And she was very upset because she was saying, you can't be teaching my child this, left-wing propaganda, because the reality is that nobody has won this race. And to me, I watched that video and I was thinking to myself, wow, how do we break this cycle of complete kind of tribal interpretation of the evidence? And before you answer that, let me just show the video I'm talking about, because it really, to me, was very striking. Give me 1 second here. And I'm going to turn on sound.
Stand up and say something. I'm not okay with that. So if you want to talk to them, it shouldn't just be to Anthony. The entire class should have this done again, and X's should be put, or different colors should be put on the homework or a new sheet, and let them understand what the process is. But I'm not the only parent who thinks this.
This is Anthony's mother.
Who's not scared to stand up and say something.
And that's Anthony's worksheet where it says Biden won. And she's very upset. She's complaining to the teacher.
Okay, I understand your concerns, and thank you for sharing your concerns. And like I said, I will talk to him tomorrow. So you're just going to talk to Anthony. This assignment's not going to get redone, and have everybody understand that we have 6 states at this point. There were 7 when this assignment was done. There's 6 that are still in litigation, and why? Even if you don't go into that kind of detail for third graders, to explain to them, you can't, this answer, who won the election, should have been the answer was nobody. That was the answer, nobody. Not Joe Biden, it was nobody. It should not just be told to my son. That's what the entire school system should be teaching if you're going to address this. Either don't address it or address it properly. There's no, well, there is gray area. There's 6 of them. So I am bringing this up. I'm not done. I am upset about this because you literally, whether you say that you said it, the homework that he brought home says completely opposite. If you did talk to them about that, that's not what you told him to color out. He told me you went up to there and put up a map. I went and put up a map. I didn't go to Google. I went to the National Archives, and then I also went to OAN, and it had exactly what he and I had been talking about. And he said, well, I don't understand. Why is this not what she showed me? And I was like, where did she go? Well, she went to Google. Well, there you go.
So Anthony's mother is an example of someone who is basically teaching Anthony that whatever you hear on CNN or you see on Google or whatever, it's all lies, and you get to pick your source of media. And Anthony's mother, I like to go to OAN, and I like to go to Breitbart or Newsmax or Epoch. And I'm just wondering, like, what is Anthony going to do when he becomes an adult and he's voting? Is he going to run the statistical probability of conspiracy theories? Or is he going to think, no, this whole left-wing conspiracy is meant to brainwash me from 3rd grade that Joe Biden won? And, how do we get out of this cycle of, I don't like your facts, I'm going to pick my alternative facts?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I can't offer an easy answer that will soothe the consciences of all of your viewers. Of course, this is something that has been developed past generations, even centuries, and it's something that will actually take the same kind of development over centuries, or at least at the very least over generations, in order to actually fundamentally change. And what I actually do on my podcast is I look at the incentive level analysis, not just what's the state of play right now and what we can do about it, but also what are the incentives at play? What does it look like in the future for our current systems to essentially play itself out and to continue going in the direction where it's going? And I think certainly, and you've given a good example, is if we leave everything alone, the incentives are kind of a railway track off a cliff right now, because you have the political incentives, you have the media incentives that actually do push for this not only to happen, not only to continue happening to Anthony or to the children of people who already subscribe to these beliefs, but you have social media incentives, you have even mainstream media incentives that are pushing people towards these beliefs who may not even have that sort of background, may not even be raised in those sorts of circumstances. The first priority, of course, has to be sort of to provide a vaccine for these types of behaviors, for these types of patterns, because quite frankly, we're not playing offense right now. We're not making a case to kind of fully heal everyone in the country or to fully kind of change the way that everyone else looks at data. We're looking at the long game here. We're looking at the incentives at play. And we have to shift the incentives that are driving people towards these narratives and instead shift them towards driving people towards actually looking at the fact-based level, actually not subscribing to partisanship, not subscribing to those tribalistic tendencies where you're playing for your own team, but instead to have kind of the ways to win, the rules of the game, actually align with the ways to govern well, the ways to actually interpret information. And of course, I'm not saying that like the lie that every politician likes to sell is that if you elect me, then all of your problems will be solved forever in the 4 years that I'm in office. And that's, of course, simply not true. And I'm not saying that you're going to have some silver bullet to solve this problem either. I just think that we need to continue the good fight. We need to be putting those arguments out there. And we need to be able to give people a choice, to change the incentives, to change the game at least a little bit, to have people who want to seek the, more high quality information, who want to go through motions, who want to go by first principles, and to actually analyze that and to reduce the incentives for partisanship for those other factors.
You know, one of the incentives that I think Andrew Yang pointed out that you could apply to the case of Anthony's mom is that I actually think Anthony's mom is in many ways an admirable character in this story, because she does care about what Anthony's learning, and she cares enough to call the teacher, which means that she has taken an interest in his education. She wants Anthony to grow up to be a great young man. But what Yang would probably say is Anthony's mom also might have a mindset of scarcity, where maybe Anthony's mom, feels like her economic situation is not as prosperous as it could have been, or she's worried about Anthony's future. She's seeing a lot of change happening around her culturally, demographically, whatever, that it's new to her, it's uncertain to her. It's natural for humans to be a little bit on their guard when they see a lot of change happening fast. And I wonder if the solution is first to try and help all Americans adapt and feel comfortable and confident and safe and secure, even though the world and technology and the economy and demographics are changing. And that would make them less susceptible to grabbing on to conspiracy theories that somehow everybody's kind of plotting against them. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, absolutely. One of the things Yang said that was one of my favorite things about his entire campaign was that when people are caught up with their everyday life, when people are fixated upon whether they're going to make their next payment, then of course they're not going to have the time to think about these broader political issues. And in fact, a lot of these instincts that people have, a lot of these kind of negative reactions are a cheat for time. They're a way to be right some of the time, but to not have to spend a lot of effort thinking about it. And this isn't that they're lazy. This is literally that people have a limited number of hours in the day. We can't all be kind of coming up with new ideas for podcasts or YouTube channels, right? But absolutely, I think that one of the things that maybe my podcast doesn't cover enough is that people's kind of basic livelihoods, basic guarantee that their children will grow up in a safe and stable country is something that has to be kind of taken care of. Of course, I'm not necessarily an expert on kind of security policy, but definitely that has to be something that gets addressed.
Well, Cactus, I really appreciate you coming into the Nerd Zone and sharing your perspective on these really fascinating topics. Any parting words or asks for the audience on how they can get to know more of your thinking and how they can stay connected with what you're working on?
Yeah, I'm Metapolitics on every major podcast platform, as well as on YouTube. And also, you can check me out on Twitter at meta_Paul, P-O-L. And thank you very much for having me on the show.
Yeah, Cactus, it's great having you on. Check out Metapolitics Podcast. Follow Cactus, meta_Paul on Twitter. And hopefully we'll have you back on. Maybe we can talk about life in the post-Trump world to see if how the media adapts to a Biden presidency. It'll be interesting to see how they are able to keep up their viewer numbers and sell more ads without Trump kind of creating all of this interesting content for them every day. All right. Well, with that, we will say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.